Here's my word. Get the hell off my spread. Now.
For more than 3 decades, a house overlooking the water in Newport Beach, California sat frozen in time. Inside its walls were the personal belongings of one of the most recognizable men in American history, a man whose face had defined an entire genre of film, whose voice had narrated the country's idea of itself for half a century. When he died in 1979, the house was locked, its contents cataloged and packed away, and for 32 years almost nothing inside it saw daylight. When the doors finally opened again, what came out wasn't just old furniture and faded photographs. It was a window into the private world of John Wayne, his triumphs, his weaknesses, his family fights, and a will that split his children apart in ways that are still being argued over today. This is a story of what was really left behind when the Duke rode off for the last time, and why the fight over his fortune says as much about Hollywood as any of his movies ever did. Before he was the Duke, he was Marion Robert Morrison, born in the small town of Winterset, Iowa, in 1907. His family was never wealthy, and when his father's business failed, they packed up and moved west of Glendale, California, chasing the same promise that pulled so many families to the coast in those years. It was in Glendale that young Marion picked up the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. Not from anything heroic, but from an oversized Airedale Terrier he was inseparable from. The local firefighters started calling the boy and his dog Big Duke and Little Duke, and the name stuck long after the dog was gone. Marion was a gifted athlete, and a football scholarship to the University of Southern California seemed like it might be his ticket to a stable, respectable future. He had plans to study law. Then a body-serving accident tore up his shoulder. The scholarship disappeared, and with it went the tidy path he thought his life was going to follow. Looking back, it's easy to see that injury as one of the luckiest unlucky breaks in Hollywood history, because it pushed him toward the studio lot instead of law office. He started at the bottom, working as a prop man and taking small, uncredited parts in silent films. It was grinding, unglamorous work, but it put him in the orbit of people who would shape the rest of his career. Most importantly, director John Ford. Ford saw potential in the broad-shouldered young man and, according to Hollywood lore, was part of the group that helped settle on a new screen name, John Wayne. It sounded strong, simple, and unmistakably American, exactly the image that would define him. For nearly a decade after that, Wayne's career was a slog. Throughout the 1930s, he appeared in dozens of low-budget westerns, churned out so quickly that some were shot in just a couple of days. The pay was barely enough to live on, and by the late 1930s, Wayne had grown so discouraged that he seriously considered walking away from acting altogether. Then came Stagecoach in 1939. The studio wanted a bigger name for the lead, but Ford fought for Wayne, and the gamble paid off. The film was a massive success, earning multiple Academy Award nominations, and it transformed Wayne overnight from a B-movie cowboy into a genuine star. From that point forward, he became the face of the American Western, a symbol of grit, independence, and old-fashioned toughness that audiences couldn't get enough of. Over the following decades, Wayne would star in some of the most enduring films of the 20th century, working again and again with Ford on movies that are still studied and celebrated today. Their partnership spanned roughly 5 decades and well over a dozen films, and it was rarely an easy one. Ford had a reputation for being brutally demanding, especially with actors he respected, and Wayne often bore the brunt of it. On at least one occasion, Ford reportedly made Wayne repeat a simple gesture more than a dozen times in front of the entire cast and crew, seemingly just to humble him. Wayne never pushed back publicly. If anything, he came to believe that Ford's harshness was part of what pushed him to deliver his best work, and the two remained close collaborators until Ford's health declined in his final years. Wayne's other defining war-era role came in 1949, when he played a hardened Marine drill sergeant in a film that earned him his first Academy Award nomination. He had initially turned the role down, worried it was too similar to characters he'd already played, and it reportedly took a substantial financial offer from the studio to change his mind. The production itself was dangerous. Live explosives and flamethrowers were used to make the battle sequences feel authentic, and Wayne was knocked unconscious during one accident on set. The finished film blended stage combat with real wartime footage so seamlessly that many viewers came away convinced they'd watched actual battlefield recordings. Despite the acclaim, Wayne lost the Oscar that year, and it would be more than a decade before he received another nomination. That next nomination came in 1970, when Wayne finally won his only competitive Academy Award for True Grit, playing a grizzled, one-eyed lawman in a performance that audiences embraced as much for the man behind it as for the character itself. He'd nearly turned that role down, too, citing his age and his recent recovery from major surgery, but reading the source novel convinced him otherwise. By the time he made his final film in the mid-1970s, playing an aging gunfighter facing his own mortality, Wayne wasn't just acting anymore. Life and art had folded into each other, and audiences sensed it. While the public saw a man who never wavered, never backed down, and always did the right thing on screen, Wayne's personal life was far messier than his on-screen persona suggested. He was married 3 times over the course of nearly 50 years, and each marriage tells its own story about the cost of life spent almost entirely in front of cameras. His first marriage, to Josephine Saenz in 1933, produced 4 children, but Wayne's growing fame and constant work kept him away from home for long stretches. During this marriage, he also became involved in a long and passionate relationship with actress Marlene Dietrich, an affair that was something of an open secret in Hollywood circles at the time. The Josephine marriage eventually ended in divorce in the mid-1940s. His second marriage, to Esperanza Bauer, was turbulent from the start. His third and final marriage, to Pilar Palit, began in 1954 and lasted, at least on paper, until his death in 1979. The couple had 3 children together, and for a number of years the marriage appeared more settled than his previous 2. But by the early 1970s, Wayne and Pilar had separated, and he spent his final years living with his secretary and companion, Pat Stacey, even though he and Pilar never formally divorced. That detail, a marriage that was never legally dissolved but had clearly ended in practice, will become one of the central mysteries of his estate when his will was finally read. Wayne's relationships with the women in his life weren't limited to his wives. His on-screen chemistry with actress Maureen O'Hara, his co-star in several beloved films, became the stuff of Hollywood legend. Audiences were convinced the two were a real-life couple, and even decades later, people close to both stars have suggested there was more to their connection than either ever fully confirmed publicly. Whatever the truth, O'Hara remained one of Wayne's closest friends until the very end of his life, standing by him through his final illness. In 1964, at the age of 57, Wayne received the kind of news that ends careers and often lives. He had lung cancer. Decades of heavy smoking had finally caught up with him. Doctors recommended an aggressive surgery to remove an entire lung along with sections of his ribs, a procedure that came with roughly a coin-flip chance of survival. Wayne made it through the surgery and lived cancer-free for several years afterward. But what made his story remarkable wasn't just that he survived. It was what he chose to do with that survival. At a time when a cancer diagnosis was treated almost like a shameful secret, something to be hidden from the public at all costs, Wayne went the opposite direction. He spoke openly about his illness, gave interviews encouraging people to get screened, and even appeared in public service messages for cancer awareness. He coined his own nickname for the disease, calling it simply the Big C, in an attempt to strip away some of the fear surrounding it. That openness mattered, because cancer wasn't finished with him. In 1979, stomach cancer was discovered, and this time there would be no remarkable recovery. Even as his health declined, Wayne continued to use whatever platform he had left to push for more funding and research into the disease. By the time he passed away at UCLA Medical Center on June 11, 1979, at the age of 72, he had spent the final stretch of his life not hiding from his diagnosis, but trying to make sure other people wouldn't have to face it alone. His death sent shockwaves through Hollywood and across the country. President Jimmy Carter publicly honored him. Fans gathered outside the hospital and at his home, leaving flowers and mementos, and a public memorial service was broadcast on television and watched by millions. The U.S. Naval Academy made him an honorary member of a graduating class, despite the fact that he had never served in the military himself, a recognition of the role he had played in shaping the public image of American service members through his films. Soon after, the airport in Orange County was renamed in his honor, cementing his name into the geography of Southern California. In the years following his death, his family established a foundation in his name dedicated to cancer research, which went on to support the creation of an institute that has contributed to real advances in early cancer detection. It was, in many ways, the legacy Wayne himself might have chosen, turning his own fight into something that could help other families avoid the same outcome. Here's where the story takes its first genuinely surprising turn. When John Wayne's estate was finally tallied after his death, it was valued at roughly $6.85 million, which, adjusted for inflation, comes out to somewhere around $25 million in today's money. For most people, that's an enormous sum. But for John Wayne, it seemed almost shockingly modest. This was a man who had been one of the highest-paid actors of his era for decades, who had starred in dozens of major studio films, who owned multiple properties across several states. Fans and observers alike expected his fortune to be in a different stratosphere entirely. So where did the rest of it go? Part of the answer is simply that Wayne lived big. He financed passion projects out of his own pocket. Most famously his long-cherished dream of making the Alamo, which he funded in part by mortgaging his own house, cars, and even his boat. The production cost millions of dollars at a time, when that kind of personal investment from an actor was almost unheard of, and the film never came close to recouping its costs at the box office. That's the kind of decision that can quietly erode a fortune over the years, even for someone earning a movie star salary. There's also the matter of assets that simply weren't part of the estate by the time he died. Wayne had owned a beloved yacht called the Wild Goose, a converted World War II minesweeper that had served as a floating retreat for him and his friends for years. Shortly before his death, he sold it for $750,000. That money went somewhere, but because the sale happened before he passed away, it never shows up in the official state accounting. It's one more thread in the larger mystery of exactly how much John Wayne actually had and where all of it ended up. Real estate tells a similar story. Wayne had a genuine love for property and land. Before settling into the Newport Beach house that would become his final home, he owned a 5-acre ranch in Encino. He also held properties in Arizona and Washington state, reflecting both his taste for wide-open spaces and a shrewd eye for land values. The Newport Beach house itself, purchased in 1965 at his home until his death in 1979, sat right on the water facing Balboa Island. From the street it looked unassuming, almost modest, which by all accounts suited Wayne's personality. Inside, though, it was spacious and comfortable, a private retreat for a man who spent his public life larger than life. After his death, that house sold for $5.5 million in 1980, a striking price of the era, and a reminder that even with a modest estate on paper, Wayne's properties alone represented serious money. If the size of the estate raised eyebrows, the contents of the will itself caused something closer to an earthquake within the Wayne family. The single biggest shock when the will was made public. John Wayne left nothing to Pilar Pallitt, his third wife, the woman he had been married to for over 20 years and who, technically, was still his wife at the time of his death. They had separated in 1973, 6 years before he died, but had never gone through with a formal divorce. In the eyes of the law, she was still Mrs. John Wayne. In the eyes of his will, she didn't exist. Instead, the bulk of his estate went to his 7 children, but specifically and pointedly to the children from his first 2 marriages. The children from his marriage to Pilar were not entirely shut out, but the distribution heavily favored the older children, and the optics will told a story all their own. A man who, in his final arrangements, drew a hard line around a marriage that had effectively ended years before his death, even though it had never been legally severed. Why would Wayne do this? There's no single confirmed answer, and that ambiguity is exactly what fueled decades of speculation. Some point to the years of separation as evidence that Wayne considered the marriage over in every way that mattered to him, regardless of what the paperwork said. Others note that his relationship with Pat Stacy, his companion during his final years, may have influenced how he thought about his obligations to Pilar. Whatever the reasoning, the practical effect was the same. A woman who had spent 2 decades as his wife and who remained legally married to him until the day he died, walked away with nothing from his estate. The will didn't just create friction between Wayne and Pilar's branch of the family. It planted seeds that would grow into full-blown legal disputes decades later. In 2010, more than 30 years after Wayne's death, his daughter Isa filed a lawsuit against her brother Ethan and John Wayne Enterprises, the company that controls the licensing and use of Wayne's name and image, arguing over her share of the business. The dispute over personal items and memorabilia named in the will only added more friction, with family members disagreeing over who was entitled to which keepsakes. Decades after his death, the Duke's family was still fighting over what he left behind. Proof that even the most carefully worded will can't always prevent the people closest to someone from ending up at odds. There's something almost ironic about all of this when you consider the image Wayne spent his career projecting. On screen, he was the man who settled disputes simply, decisively, and permanently. The guy who walked into a room, said what needed to be said, and walked back out with the matter closed for good. Off screen, his own final arrangements left behind a tangle of unresolved questions that his children and grandchildren would still be untangling in courtrooms more than 3 decades later. It's a reminder that even the most carefully cultivated public image rarely tells the whole story of what's happening behind closed doors, and that the people who play larger-than-life heroes are, in the end, just as capable of leaving complicated, messy situations behind them as anyone else. While the legal and financial disputes played out in courtrooms and law offices, something else was happening to the physical traces of John Wayne's life, and it's this part of the story that gives the title of this video its real meaning. When Wayne died in 1979, his Newport Beach home was effectively sealed. His personal belongings, everything from his clothing and books to scripts, awards, furniture, and photographs, were packed up and placed into storage. And then, for reasons that combine legal complexity, family disputes, and simple inertia, almost none of it saw the light of day again for over 30 years. Think about what that actually means. Somewhere in storage facilities, boxes sat untouched containing the actual scripts Wayne had worked from on set, pages he had folded down to mark scenes he'd already filmed, notes in his own handwriting, the physical artifacts of how one of the biggest stars in the world actually did his job. His clothing sat folded in boxes. Awards he'd won sat in the dark. Letters, personal correspondence that could reveal sides of him the public never saw, sat unread by anyone outside the family for decades. For a man whose public image was so carefully constructed and so widely known, this hidden cache represented something genuinely